The first time I noticed something unusual about the old house across the fence, I thought it was my imagination. Every morning, just after sunrise, sunlight poured through the tall windows, revealing flashes of color unlike anything I had ever seen. It looked as though the walls themselves were glowing. Sometimes I caught brief glimpses of paintings leaning against wooden stands, shelves overflowing with strange little sculptures, and dozens of unfinished canvases. I never meant to stare, but after losing my wife and spending nearly 2 years drifting through life like a ghost, those mysterious flashes of beauty became the only thing that made me step outside each morning. I stood quietly in my own backyard, pretending to water flowers that barely survived, while secretly wondering what kind of life existed inside that colorful house. Then one morning, the owner looked straight at me, smiled, and instead of closing the curtains or walking away, simply said, "If you want to see, just ask." Before this remarkable story begins, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone who believes in kindness and second chances, and subscribe to Storyverse. Your support helps us continue sharing stories that remind the world compassion still exists. My name is Rowan Mercer, and until that morning, I had forgotten what it felt like to be curious. After my wife, Nora, passed away from a sudden illness, every day became painfully identical. I still woke before dawn because old habits refused to disappear, but instead of preparing breakfast for two, I quietly drank coffee alone while staring at an empty chair. Friends visited during the first few months, but grief is exhausting, and eventually everyone returned to their own busy lives. They assumed time would heal everything. Time certainly changed things, but it never replaced what was missing. It simply taught me how to carry silence. The neighborhood itself seemed frozen in time. Children rode bicycles after school, neighbors waved politely while mowing their lawns, and elderly couples walked dogs every evening. Life continued exactly as it should, yet I always felt like I was watching it through invisible glass. Everyone belonged somewhere except me. The only exception was the weathered blue house beyond the cedar fence. Its owner had moved in about 6 months earlier. Delivery trucks arrived constantly, unloading enormous wooden crates marked as fragile. Sometimes I heard soft classical music drifting through open windows, followed by the gentle tapping of tools or brushes against canvas. I imagined an artist lived there, but no one in the neighborhood seemed to know much about them. That morning when I was caught staring, embarrassment washed over me immediately. I expected an angry response or at least a suspicious look. Instead, the neighbor laughed softly, opened the gate, and repeated the invitation with such warmth that my embarrassment slowly dissolved into cautious curiosity. The owner introduced herself as Maren Ellsworth. She appeared to be somewhere in her early 60s, with silver hair tied loosely behind her neck and hands permanently stained with bright colors from years of painting. Her smile carried the peaceful confidence of someone who had survived storms without allowing them to harden her heart. Stepping inside her home felt like entering another world. Every room overflowed with creativity. Giant landscapes covered the walls. Tiny wooden birds rested on shelves. Half-finished portraits stood beside stained glass windows that filled every corner with dancing colors. The entire house breathed with life. Maren noticed how overwhelmed I looked but never rushed me. She simply allowed me to wander slowly from room to room, touching nothing, absorbing everything. She eventually admitted that the house had once belonged to her parents. After retiring from teaching art at a community college, she returned to restore it into a workshop where anyone willing to learn could create something meaningful. She explained that children, veterans, widows, retirees, and teenagers all visited throughout the week. Nobody paid. Nobody competed. They simply made art together because creating something beautiful often helped people repair parts of themselves words could never reach. I confessed that I knew absolutely nothing about painting. She smiled again. According to Maren, neither did anyone else before they picked up their first brush. I almost laughed. For reasons I couldn't explain, I agreed to return the following Saturday. That single decision quietly changed the direction of my life. The first class felt awkward. My hands trembled holding the brush. Everyone else seemed far more talented. An elderly mechanic carved birds from driftwood. A teenage girl painted flowers inspired by memories of her grandmother. A retired nurse experimented with watercolor landscapes. Nobody criticized anyone else's work. When I finally placed color onto the blank canvas, I froze. Every brushstroke reminded me of Nora. She had loved autumn leaves. She had loved orange sunsets. She had loved little gardens filled with wildflowers. Without realizing it, I painted memories instead of scenery. When I finished, tears quietly rolled down my face. Nobody stared. Nobody offered pity. Marin simply placed a clean cloth beside me and nodded as though she understood everything without needing explanations. Week after week I returned. Painting slowly became less about creating pictures and more about remembering without collapsing beneath the weight of those memories. Eventually I found myself laughing again. Not loudly. Not often. But genuinely. Neighbors began noticing the difference. Instead of avoiding conversations, I started helping others repair fences, trim trees, or carry groceries. Somehow the confidence growing inside that colorful studio spilled naturally into everyday life. Months later, Marin suggested organizing a neighborhood art fair. The idea sounded impossible. Most people insisted nobody would come. Still, she believed communities sometimes needed only one excuse to reconnect. Everyone contributed something. Children painted sidewalks with washable chalk. Families baked cookies. Musicians volunteered. Local gardeners donated flowers. On the morning of the event, the once quiet street transformed into something magical. People wandered from booth to booth smiling at paintings, sculptures, quilts, photographs, and handmade crafts. Neighbors who had lived beside one another for years finally shared conversations that lasted longer than polite greetings. Watching strangers admire my own paintings felt surreal. They weren't masterpieces. They were simply honest. One elderly visitor stopped in front of a canvas showing autumn sunlight filtering through golden trees. She quietly whispered that it reminded her of walks with her late husband. She thanked me. She didn't know she had unknowingly returned the greatest compliment imaginable. For the first time since Nora's passing, I realized memories didn't have to exist only as pain. Sometimes they could become gifts. The following spring, Marin became seriously ill. She insisted it was nothing important, but treatments forced her to spend more time resting than painting. Without asking, members of the community began maintaining the workshop together. Teenagers swept floors. Parents repaired leaking gutters. Retirees organized supplies. Former students taught beginner classes. The place Marin built through kindness continued thriving because kindness always multiplies when people choose to share it. One afternoon while arranging fresh canvases, I found an old notebook tucked inside a cabinet. It contained hundreds of names. Beside every name was a short note. Some had overcome addiction. Some survived grief. Some rebuilt broken families. Others simply learned to smile again. At the very end, beneath my own name, Marin had written only one sentence. He finally looked beyond the fence. Those words stayed with me for days. I eventually understood she had never been talking about the wooden fence separating our houses. She meant the invisible walls grief had built around my heart. Months later, Marin recovered enough to attend another neighborhood gathering. The applause that welcomed her back lasted several minutes. Children hugged her. Adults wiped away tears. No expensive monument could ever honor someone's life better than witnessing dozens of people become kinder because of one person's quiet generosity. As the sun slowly lowered over the neighborhood, families spread blankets across freshly cut grass while music drifted gently through the evening air. I stood exactly where I had once hidden behind my garden pretending to water dying flowers. Everything looked different now, though the houses had not changed. The difference was entirely inside me. I finally understood that healing rarely arrives through dramatic miracles. Sometimes it begins with curiosity. Sometimes it begins with someone choosing kindness instead of suspicion. Sometimes it begins with 7 simple words spoken across an ordinary backyard. If you want to see, just ask. If this story has touched your heart so far, please like this video, share it with someone who may need hope today, leave your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to Storyverse so together we can continue spreading stories that remind people kindness still changes lives.